Hello, and welcome to another action-packed episode of The Medicine Show. Today I want to talk to you about a medicinal plant that probably almost all of you are familiar with in some form or another, and yet which even a lot of professional herbalists seem to have some confusion and misconceptions about. And that plant is lettuce. A lot of the time in herbal medicine we talk about it as wild lettuce, but really it's includes garden lettuce as well. Lactica sativa is garden lettuce. Lactica cereola is one of the few species of wild lettuce, and they're really not separate plants. They're kind of like the difference between a chihuahua and a wolf. They have some differences between them, but they're actually basically the same plant. This is Lactica as you would commonly find it growing in the wild, either escaped from cultivation or brought over to North America as a stowaway, and it's very commonly found along roadsides, waysides, and waste places, disturbed ground, that sort of thing. And it's native to northern Africa and Eurasia. So there is a clinical history of use of this plant going back at least to the pre-dynastic period of ancient Egypt. Lettuce was associated with the ancient Egyptian god Min, who was and to some extent still is revered as a fertility god. So you may be wondering exactly what it is that Lactica does. And the answer to that sort of depends on how it is harvested and processed. Writing some 30 centuries after pre-dynastic Egypt and approximately 20 centuries before the present time, the Greek herbalist Dioscorides says that it's good for the stomach and the bowels, that it's cooling, and it causes sleep and relieves pain. He notes that cultivated lettuce, when it shoots into a stalk, has milky sap that's similar to that of wild lettuce, and that sap was similar in its properties to poppies and occasionally was mixed with the juice of poppies for pain and sleep, and that it draws down milk and menstrual flow. He mentions it being taken for spider and scorpion bites. Dioscorides says that the milky juice was exposed to the sun and then stored in ceramic jars. This would have allowed the latex, the sap, to evaporate and become a gummy substance, which, according to Dioscorides, the Magi referred to by the name Sanguis Titanis, meaning blood of the Titans. The first place that I ever heard of the medicinal properties of lettuce, however, was not from Dioscorides. It was from a much more recent author, a famous botanist and illustrator, Beatrix Potter, in The Tale of the Flopsy Bunnies. If you grew up in the English-speaking world during the 20th century, there's a good chance that you also heard this story, but there's also a very good chance that you grew up and forgot all about it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Flopsy Bunnies and the medicinal property of lettuce. The Flopsy Bunnies are a group of 6 rabbit siblings, children of Peter Rabbit's cousin Benjamin and his wife Flopsy. Rabbits, of course, are a matrilineal society, so they're called by their mother's name, the Flopsy Bunnies. And they are driven by food insecurity to go over to Mr. McGregor's place and eat out of his compost heap. And one day they find some lettuces that have been thrown there because they've shot into flower. That is to say that the stalk has started growing and the flower buds have started developing on the stalk. And this is really good food for them, so they absolutely stuff their faces with it. And it makes them very tired. In fact, it makes them fall directly asleep. And even when the farmer comes around and picks them up and puts them in a bag, they're just pleasantly dreaming that they're being tucked into bed, and they have no idea what is happening to them because of the soporific effect of the lettuce that they've eaten. In the end, they do get rescued by their neighbor and comrade Thomasina Tittlemouse. Beatrix Potter, who, unlike her younger cousin Harry Potter, paid lots of attention in herbology class, notes that lettuce is known for its soporific effect, but that she personally has never experienced it. She supposes that this may be because she is not a rabbit. I think it's also probably because, typically speaking, when we consume lettuce as a vegetable, we don't like it to be very, very bitter, so we eat it when it's young enough that it has clear sap, and once it's begun to bolt or shoot into flower and has milky sap, people don't really eat it so much anymore. This, of course, is lettuce in the form that is familiar to most people. We could call this Lactica sativa or Lactica scariola variant sativa, possibly X green leaf or X red leaf for the specific cultivars. When lettuce is young and hasn't been exposed to too much sunlight, it isn't very bitter. But even with regular grocery store lettuce, you may notice that the part of the leaf that is closest to the stem, the bottom part of the leaf, sometimes tastes pretty bitter. And you may have noticed that if you cut the very base of a head of lettuce, that sometimes there's a slightly milky, somewhat clear sap that comes out. And this is the lettuce juice with some latex in it. As the plant begins to grow, this sap gets more viscous, more thick and opaque, and it becomes more bitter, and it also takes on a certain smell that I don't really have good terminology for describing, other than perhaps to say that it smells kind of like opium, which will mean nothing to the vast majority of people. By the time the plant has come fully into flower, it loses some of that bitterness and some of that medicinal potency. So really the ideal time to gather the sap from the lettuce is right before it starts flowering. A couple hundred years ago, specifically on the 6th of March, 1810, there was a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine called Observations on the Preparation of Soporific Medicines from Common Garden Lettuce by Andrew Duncan. This was at a time when opium gum, not morphine, but opium gum itself, in its more or less raw form, was kind of the go-to remedy for anesthesia and pain and so forth. It was very widely used, but people had also noticed that sometimes it killed people, sometimes it made people itch, sometimes it caused various different problems. And Dr. Duncan laid out a process for making an alternative to opium gum out of common garden lettuce, cultivated lettuce in this case. The process that he describes is simply letting the lettuce start to shoot into flower and then topping it, scraping off the milky latex and keeping that, and then cutting it again a little bit further down the stalk and collecting the sap again, and so on and so forth, and then allowing the collected juice to dry, in which case it would lose about half of its weight and become a gummy substance. This was really not any different than the process Dioscorides had described many centuries before, except that it was a little more detailed. But because the New England Journal of Medicine was and is a very impactful medical journal, read by people everywhere, this sort of created a level of popularity for lettuce gum, lacticaria as they called it, which had not existed at that time. And from then right up until the 1920s or so, lettuce gum or lettuce extract became sort of a niche thing that was very widely used. It wasn't used in anything like the quantity that opium was, but it was very widely used and very widely available. One of the largest producers of it was the Shaker community, who were and are a religious group. And in those days, they had lots of communities in different places in the country and lots of small-scale industries. And they produced a lot of the opium and also a lot of the lettuce opium or lacticaria that was used. in those days. This pharmacology reference from the late 1800s describes it as being a brown or reddish brown substance that was usually sold in pea-size balls. And the exact pharmacology of what is in lacticarium has never been fully elucidated. We don't exactly know which substances in it are responsible for its medicinal properties. Every once in a while, something like this will make the rounds on the internet, similar to opium, the best natural painkiller that grows in your backyard. And I would call that something of a dubious statement. It's similar to opium in some ways and quite different from opium in other ways. And I think for the most part, people making that sort of statement have probably not actually used opium in a therapeutic context before. The similarity, of course, is that wild lettuce is a sedative and pain reliever, and so is opium. The difference is that even when it's produced under the best conditions, and lettuce is an extremely variable plant because there's a lot of genetic differences in different varieties of lettuce, and there is a lot of difference within one single plant over the course of its lifetime in how bitter it is and how much of its medicinal substances are in it. But even under the ideal production conditions of harvesting the plant at just the right time, meticulously cutting the plant down bit by bit and collecting the juices and concentrating them and so forth, even doing that, the finished product is not only significantly less potent than opium, which if that's all it was, that wouldn't be a big deal because it would just be, a matter of using a different dose. It's not only less concentrated and less potent than opium, it is of somewhat different a nature in terms of how it works. On the whole, I would say that the lettuce concentrate is sedating. It produces a sleep that is more like natural sleep than what someone would get from taking an opioid. It is better for sharp pain rather than dull pain. It has more of an effect on new injuries and sources of pain than it would have on old injuries and chronic sources of pain. It does not seem to have the respiratory suppression that opioids have to any significant degree, not in the doses that I've used it in, not in the in my experience of it, which is, somewhat limited, but also this is the same comment has been made by other people who used it over the centuries and so forth. And especially during the 1800s, there were a lot of people who were sometimes using it as a surgical anesthetic and things that I have certainly not done with it, and making some comments to the same effect about it. It does slow loose stools some. It slows the bowels some, but it does not completely stop movement of the bowels the way that poppy does. In fact, sometimes because of its action on the liver as a bitter herb, it can actually help the bowels to move some. As a remedy for spastic coughing, I think that it is actually better than opium. It allows people to rest and get some sleep instead of being woken up by coughing without putting them in the same kind of danger of just not breathing. So that's a really helpful distinction, and something where it being less toxic than poppy actually makes it more effective medicine in some ways. While there don't seem to be any actual structural opioids, nothing that has actually got the chemical structure of an opioid in wild lettuce, I somewhat suspect that it interacts with the mu opioid receptor, as do a lot of other herbal medicines, and also with acetylcholine receptors in the nervous system. And there's been a little bit of research that backs that idea up, done with some animal tissue experiments, specifically rabbit, and that's, not entirely necessarily applicable to human beings because, as Beatrix Potter reminded us so long ago, we're not rabbits, and so it might act differently on their bodies than it would on ours. I've also had people ask, what about just making a tincture? Is it possible to just take the dried lettuce leaves and mix them with alcohol and let it steep like we do with so many other herbs? And the answer is yes. That's a perfectly feasible way to make medicine out of this plant. The virtues that are in it are completely soluble in alcohol or dispersible in alcohol and water, and so you can do that. It is worth noting, however, that when you do make it that way, it's not very strong. It's a sedative that is somewhere on a par with, I would say, chamomile or so, maybe a little bit stronger than chamomile, maybe a little bit less strong than passion flower, but somewhere in that general order of magnitude. So definitely not a super powerful sedative when it's made that way, but a very usable medicine, a very usable herbal product. Thanks for joining me for this episode of The Medicine Show. Feel free to leave any questions or comments in the comment section, and if you like what you see, feel free to subscribe, and I will see you on the next exciting episode. Thanks.